podcast that you're listening to is being presented to you with the cooperation of the SJ Network. If you're a person who needs a publicist and you want to appear on podcasts, contact Stephen Joyner at s-j-network.com. Let's get on with the show.
I'm looking forward to today's interview with Allison Church. She's written many horror and fantasy novels.
Maybe I'll check some out. I've finally gotten over my fear of ghosts.
That's the spirit.
Oh, no. Don't tell me it's back again.
Attention, rebels of the Sherpalution. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. We would like to give you a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial simply by heading to www.audibletrial.com/Sherpa. There are over 180,000 titles of audiobooks and podcasts, including this one, to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. And now, the one and only Mr. Bruce will lead you into the Sherpa Chalet. As a reminder, since the Sherpa is a man of questionable taste, many of the foods sold in our cafeteria will be also.
Coming to you from Sherpa Chalet in beautiful downtown Mount Podcastia, it's time for entertainment interviews in the Sherpa screening room. Grab an aisle seat and a bucket of popcorn, but don't crunch too loud or you'll miss the show. Now, here's your host, Jim, the podcast Sherpa.
Hello there, Rebels, and welcome to the Sherpa Screening Room, a presentation of Too Many Podcasts. Yeah, we got a lot of them this season, don't we? Who's me? I'm also the host of Too Many Podcasts. My name is Jim, the podcast Sherpa, and I will be here for an interview with somebody from the entertainment field. And today we get to speak to an author. Her name is Allison Church. Really fascinating lady that I got to know. She's got a fascinating story to it. I get to say the word fascinating a lot, but hey, they're fascinating. What can I say? And a real fan of horror, and she writes horror and fantasy novels. And you can tell she's a big fan, and we got to talk about that. We also spoke about the interesting perspective that she has on life and how she uses that in her unique characters in her books. But why am I talking? Why don't we just head on over to the Sherpa Screening Room and let's hear what Allison Church has to say right now. Hello there, Rebels. Welcome to the Sherpa Screening Room. My guest today is an author and a lover of all things spooky, horror, mystery, supernatural, fantasy. It's all there in her books. You might know some titles such as Marley, The Other Christmas Carol, The Keeper at the Gates, Drop Dead Gorgeous, Dark Passenger, The Lurker War. And I know that's part of a series, but there's all sorts of stuff here. But let's get to know her. Her name is Allison Church, coming to us from the Midwest. Allison, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I like telling stories. It's a big part of my personality. I can't really, when I talked to you when we talked, it was a story. It's something that's been with me all my life. I was the kid that would usually tell the ghost stories with the flashlight and, the campfires. And from there, it just evolved into, it's like, I see bored people. I have to go up to them and say, I got a story for this. And then hopefully I terrify them enough where they can't go to sleep for at least 2 days.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and maybe assume you were influenced by Stephen King when you were growing up?
Yes. And I was also influenced by Stephen King's influencer. He was a very famous author, but not that many people know him, by the name of Richard Matheson.
Okay.
Those two writers, Stephen King and Richard Matheson, basically formed the matrix of my nightmares. And from those nightmares, I came up with some of my own that I hope inspire someone someday down the road.
So what gave you the courage to write your first book?
Well, my first book, I was concerned with the way that the world was developing, and I was wondering what would happen if the entire world was in a totalitarian state. And they needed a scapegoat, like in Fahrenheit 451, where the scapegoat was books. Only bad things come from books. Well, I figured to take that a step further and say only bad things come from religion. So what would mankind be if they lived in a world where religion, no matter what, from being an atheist to a Zen Buddhist, if whatever you do, if they caught you doing anything religious, it was either the death penalty or being in prison for life. And I created a book called The Forsaken, which kind of talks that way. And I hope I don't turn into Nostradamus, but the bad guy in the book is the United Nations and NATO. So it makes me wonder.
We'll keep our fingers crossed on that one.
Oh, God, yes, please. If I was in my book, I would have just been killed.
I guess some of your titles do take actual events or known fictional events and take them a step further, don't they?
Oh, yes. Like I was saying to some people in you today, one of my favorite books is called Dark Passenger. It's a horror novel, but it takes place on board the Titanic.
Okay.
It's one of my favorites. I actually came across the seed that was the inspiration from the story by doing research on the Titanic. I was going to write a fictionalized story for the Titanic, but James Cameron came along and ruined that idea.
You got some nerve.
Yeah, the cheek of the man. I saw an article that was written in 1922, and it said that in the article, the Titanic was not the victim of an iceberg, but the victim of a mummy's curse. Obviously, there was a mummy's case that was going to the New York Museum of Natural History. Of course, it never got there. Mm-hmm. And I just took that idea, added some imaginational steroids. And the fact that when I was a child, I loved all the Amicus or Hammer horror films that starred Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. Threw that in with a little Basil Rathbone and Jack the Ripper, and I came up with a hell of an interesting story that not only is factual when it comes to the mentioning of the events on the Titanic, but also have some theories of what would have happened if the iceberg would have, if the Titanic would have rammed the iceberg head on. And I try to make the first officer realize that that's what he has to do. But something mysterious and magical and dark gets in the way and makes the Titanic go hard to starboard instead of slow ahead. And the reason why I did that is because when they found the wreck of the Titanic, the telemotors, which tell the engineer in the engineering room how to go and what to do, were all on slow ahead. There was no hard to starboard. So, I took that and said, what if? I love doing stuff like that. I mean, that makes writing not only fun, but it makes it less of a task, and you enjoy it while you're doing it.
You took A Christmas Carol and did the point of view from Jacob Marley. Yes.
When I first read Charles Dickens' classic novella, I was everyone else is going, cool, great, ghost. Me, I was kind of pissed off when I was a kid because I raised my hand and said, what about Jacob Marley? I mean, he saved the soul of his earthly best friend and partner, knowing that he would not be rewarded for it. And I said, he not only did this once, but he did it 3 times. That should count for suck points in heaven. From that little gripe that I had as a kid, this sprang forth, because ever I have something like that, I always keep it in the back of my mind. Never know when I'm going to use it. And then one day I was just happened to watch a very great adaptation of A Christmas Carol, which starred the late George C. Scott. He was an excellent Scrooge. And I'm watching this and I'm going, again with Marley. What happened to Marley? And it always bugged me. And being American and having to deal with a British classic, that was tough, because I'm going, well, they're probably going to think, who is this upstart colonial that thinks he can write Dickens? In the book, I never claimed to be Dickens. All I did was say, this is a story of Americans in the house that used to belong to Jacob Marley, and before that, Ebenezer Scrooge. That's all it is. It's a story in that house, which happens to be haunted, by the way.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because, when Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, it really wasn't intended to be like a holiday story. It was a ghost story.
Yeah. That always peeved him off. Yeah. That always peeved him off. But at the same time, when he was starting to have problems with his family and stuff like that, he realized that it was a special story. It's like I guess you could probably compare it to William Shatner or Leonard Nimoy. They had to surrender and release themselves to the fact that they were only going to be remembered for one role.
And I think no one knows that fact better than you, because you are a Star Trek lover.
God, yes, I love Star Trek. I'm wearing a disco shirt, for Star Trek Discovery. So I love Star Trek. I wish, and it can segue into who I am and what I represent. I wish that Star Trek would have a transgender character on board, to where at the beginning of the episode it's like alpha male, and then after the credits, this person decides to become a woman, to serve the Federation and Starfleet as a woman. And I'm not so much the character itself's point of view, but I'd like to see the episode where it would go through the dynamic of the muscle memory of the ship and how they respond to, cadet or ensign alpha male becoming ensign drop dead gorgeous girl.
Yeah, and you bring up an interesting point. You are a transgender author, and very open about that. Now, when you started writing, you were Donald's.
Yes.
So, did your perspective when you wrote ever change? I know sometimes people say you're writing from a woman's perspective, writing from a man's perspective, or just from a writer's perspective. Where did you fall in there?
It was just a writer's perspective, but later in life, as I was transitioning, I realized that the female voice in me was talking all the time. One of the books that you mentioned was something that I did right on the cusp of me coming out and telling people I was transgender. The name of the book is Drop Dead Gorgeous. It's a story about a man that cheats on his wife, and she's, BSC.
Okay.
And she's like, I'm trying to keep it clean. And she goes nuts, and she knocks her husband out, wakes him up. He's in her lab. She works on like RNA reprogramming and DNA sequencing. She's a geneticist. And to prove him a lesson, she turns him into, inch by inch, the most beautiful woman that science can provide her and him with, because it's his DNA they're working on. And I couldn't think of anything more horrifying to the average male than to wake up every day, inch by inch, and realize that they're turning into a woman. Great revenge story. But at the same time, I was exploring the things that I couldn't dare to explore. And fiction can be fun.
This is also kind of touched upon in your trilogy too, isn't it?
Yes. I did a fantasy trilogy called The Known World Chronicles without the K. It's NOWN. And it's in 3 books, The Misadventures of Karan the Knight, The Lurker War, which you mentioned, and the 3rd one is called The Return of Karan the Knight. And basically, it's a story about a knight and a squire that get involved in serious adventures. Like in the first book, Karan the Knight he's sort of like a Lancelot character. He gets convicted or condemned from a crime that he did not commit. But he's blamed because him and the victim were very close. Unfortunately for him, the victim's mother is like a Wicca master. She's like into the science and magical arts. And to punish him, because even though he is a good-hearted man, he's also kind of a little vain and egocentric. And she decides to turn him into the most beautiful woman on the planet. And to add insult to injury, because he is so status, oriented in his life, he makes his squire fall in love with him. And then he ends up, as a girl, falling in love with him. And they got to go on a quest to find his manhood again. He has to find the Wicca master and get back his manhood. While going through all these obstacles, he has to, fight elves, dwarves, wizards, vampires, dragons. And the squire has his own little struggle that he has to do, because it is his nature and his duty to help his master complete her quest. However, unbeknownst to Karan or the wizard that cast the spell, the squire has deeply fallen in love with his master. And he has to ask himself the conundrum, does he help his master complete his quest, or does he fail his master to keep his one true love? Deep stuff.
I was reading like one of the reviews of your books, I guess one of your more recent ones, The Keeper at the Gates.
Yes.
And well, because you're a lover of horror, actually, I'll drop a little hint here. And one of the reviews said, "Don't read it with the lights off."
It is kind of an H.P. Lovecraft-esque story about the question of man and faith. So that is a struggle that goes on with characters in books and short stories that I love. That's really dear to my heart. Mm-hmm. Because do we really know the deities that we worship and believe in? Because, with so many empires falling and popes and kings rewriting and abolishing certain things, is the book of instructions we have faulty by default? Or are we just losing something in the translation? Because it did go from Greek to, Latin and Latin to the native languages. It's a story about a rebellious priest who doesn't conform that much. And he is given a church of his own, not as a reward, but to get him the hell away from the people that he's bothered. And it's that kind of dynamic that really attracts me in my storytelling. I like the outsider. I like the person who is a nonconformist, the person who questions. If somebody gives them a blue picture going, how do you know that's not green? And we're just colorblind or something like that. I like that stuff.
I was going to say, that seems to be a recurring theme, even though you're writing completely different books. They question stuff, but maybe while trying to scare the hell out of you at the same time.
Yes. I honestly believe that if they're having a bad day, and if a person can recapture that 9 to 12-year-old that on Friday nights would watch that one UHF channel that had like Creature Feature or Friday Fright Night or something on, and watch these horrible movies, but in the adventure of watching them would like have their pillow up to their eyes like this and relive, that magic moment. It might make them a little younger again.
Was there a particular movie or a book that kind of flipped the switch for you to get into that genre?
Oh, God. There were two. The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty, and of course, Hell House by Richard Matheson. Both made into excellent movies. One is more known because it got more press. Hell House was made into a movie called The Legend of Hell House. Unfortunately, it was released the same time that The Exorcist was, and by not so much money as Warner Brothers put into their product. But it had excellent stars in it. It was an excellently made film about paranormal activity in a famous haunted house. Kind of like, decades later, Stephen King, who, like I said, was inspired by Richard Matheson, wrote Rose Red, which I'm sure he had Hell House in mind when he wrote it. Because if you ever watch both of them, there's a comparison. And I'm not saying that Stephen King did anything wrong. I mean, I borrowed stuff from him too, but shh.
You see, you're saving me, Allison. Don't worry.
Yeah.
When you're writing a book, what's the first idea that has to come to you? I mean, do you have like maybe items that you want to question and then work a story around it? Or do you come up with a premise where that character is questioning something that may go on in the world?
Now, sometimes I like to start off with a question. Like when I did Dark Passenger, I started off with the question, what if the Titanic was sunk by a mummy's curse? From there, I had to do tons of research on the Titanic because my main character, even though he was an archaeologist, his best friend on the voyage was Thomas Andrews, who was the naval architect who built and designed and built the Titanic. So I had to know what was going on so that when Mr. Andrews talked, it would represent, him fictitiously in what he would have done in such a fictitious world. Sometimes if I don't do the question, I will do a one paragraph premise on a 5x8 index card, and I'll put it away and salt it away. And then sometimes when I'm having writer's block, I'll go back to those 5x8 and go, oh, this looks different. And I'll set it down, and then I'll evolve the 5x8 index card into the 1 to 3 page story idea. If it still intrigues me, that's when I start doing a chapter by chapter outline. And I decide, okay, this is going to be either a short story, a novella, or a novel. Now, I will say that sometimes when I started out my writing, and I thought it was going to be a short story or a novella, the characters themselves came to life in my imagination and caused the story to write itself, if that makes any sense. It's magic. When you get that, and I'm sure other writers or creative people out there will relate to this. You're writing and you're looking up and it's like 2:00 in the afternoon, and then you look back down and you're writing and you're writing, and what you perceive is maybe an hour or two have gone by, and then you look back up and it's 12:30 in the morning, and you're not exhausted. In fact, you're filled with so much energy. It's like you're very invigorated and you want to just keep writing, but you know that you do have to go to your real job in the morning, so you got to try to cop some snooze before the alarm clock goes off. So basically, it's sort of an evolutionary step from a question to a paragraph to a small descriptive to this chapter by chapter. And sometimes, even when I do the chapter by chapter outline, it can go way off third base and just keep going in another direction. That's when the magic happens and the characters take over.
Mm-hmm. So really, I guess once you start writing these characters, you probably get to the point with some of them that they're so fleshed out that you can put yourself inside their heads and say, okay, they're thinking this, they're going to do that. And there carries the story. Oh God, yes. There's a special shtick that I use when I'm writing. Every book that I write, every single one of them, whether I'm male or female, I am personally one of the characters in the book. When I'm writing, I see this like mind's picture of a panoramic movie screen. And as I'm writing it, I'm seeing this movie going on as I'm writing it. And one of the characters is always me. And one of the fun things that I like to do with someone who's read some of my books is I go, oh, really? You read that book? Yeah, in that book, I actually made myself one of the characters. Can you guess who I am? And sometimes I have a great fun with that. Sometimes they'll get it smack dab because I will give them obvious clues. Other times they go, are you this person? And I go, you're ice cold, and I'll just play that game with them. And I think that's a good way, besides the enjoyment of the story, for the reader to have fun with meeting the author, because sometimes, and it's no fault of our own because writers are kind of awkward people anyway. I have a problem sometimes dealing with the public. I'll be very, very shy, or I'll go spits knots crazy, and I'll just be overly caffeinated. There is no medium ground. So to kind of calm me down, I play that game with them first. And I guess because you're writing so many different genres, you were saying you're always one of the characters. Maybe Allison gets a little buried in the character that you've created too, which is maybe why it's not always painfully obvious. Yeah, dangerously so. There are times, and I'm sure that people who love to read and absorb themselves within the same, energy, when I'm done writing a book, 9 chances out of 10, it makes me really sad. So I think that's why most of the bodies of my work have continuations, because I don't want the characters to stop. Mm-hmm. I want them to keep going and evolving like I'm evolving. I want them to keep going and learning. When I first started my journey, I was a different person, obviously. Okay. Change is inevitable. That's just one of the main adult facts of life. Sure. But when change can be magical, or when change can be enjoyable, that's a good story. And that's what I try to put on paper. That's definitely an interesting way to look at it, and then in the whole creative process too. Yes. You said that you are a pop culture fanatic. I love anything to do with 1960s, 70s, some 80s,
television and facts. I mean, I grew up on, I don't know if you remember the series, but one of my favorite series was called Kolchak the Night Stalker.
With Darren McGavin.
Yes. Chris Carter, the creator of the X-Files, said that television series influenced him to create the X-Files, where there's that dynamic between the believer and the skeptic. In Kolchak, it was Kolchak and his editor, Anthony Vincenzo, whereas in the X-Files, it was Mueller and Scully. And it was cool to see Darren McGavin on the X-Files in one episode. He was originally supposed to play Carl Kolchak, but he couldn't get the rights from Universal. Kolchak the Night Stalker was like that, the $6 Million Man, The Twilight Zone, Lost in Space, until it got corny, and Batman, which was corny. I loved all that stuff when I was a kid. I would, it was my fix. It was like my drug-induced fix. After I watched an episode of Star Trek, especially Star Trek, I was cool for about a couple hours.
So when Lost in Space got corny, was that when the robots started going, warning, warning, oh dear, Major Doom? I loved the robot. The B9 robot was excellent. What I didn't understand, and later I found out it was because of the influence of the Batman television series, which it competed against. In the original concept, Dr. Smith was not a cowardly comic relief who had the robot as his side, a straight man. He was an evil bastard, and he reprogrammed the robot to be his bodyguard so that Don West and Dr. Robinson wouldn't kick his ass and kill him. And basically, if they tried to, he'd snap his fingers and the B9 robot would put out its arms and, flash its little, isotopes, and they'd stop. And then suddenly it went to color, and the next thing we knew, Dr. Smith got like a balsectomy. I mean, he became a wuss puss. And I talked to Jonathan Harris once about that, and he said one word. He looked up and went, Batman. Batman changed everything for Lost in Space. They had to go in color because of Lost in Space. Right.
And I mean, I like the new series. The new series is good, but it took away the fun of the robot being a homegrown product, and instead now it's like a alien byproduct. Granted, the dark history and the coulda, wouldas, and shouldas and what ifs behind it are enticing, but I still like the danger, Will Robinson, danger.
I think a lot of today's audiences just don't get the campiness of 60s and 70s TV.
Well, even to a certain extent, Star Trek, in its own way, was campy. I mean, the chemistry between Spock and McCoy, that was a total accident. They did it in one episode, the writers liked it, and it just kept going until the end.
Any favorite horror movies?
There was an old Vincent Price American International movie done called The Last Man on Earth. Everybody today knows it as I Am Legend. They've made 3 movies, Last Man on Earth, starring Vincent Price, The Omega Man, which starred Charlton Heston, and, of course, the Will Smith I Am Legend. Of all those incarnations, the Vincent Price movie is the closest to the truism of the novel. And, of course, the novel was written by Richard Matheson. I used to watch that all the time. If it was on Friday Fright Night, my nose was this far from the screen. It was like I was glued to that screen, commercials, bathroom break. But I love that movie. I also like The Exorcist. The Exorcist gave me nightmares for years. I snuck in with a friend of mine who was over the age of 18 because that was one of the first movies that they did the restricted rated R movies on. And I watched it, but I kind of watched it like this. I met Linda Blair at a Dragon Con, and I told her that, and she stood up and hugged me and said, "I'm sorry, but it was my job." That was good. But I would say Last Man on Earth, The Exorcist, and there were a couple sci-fi movies that, I love the Vincent Price version of The Fly. Jeff Goldblum's was okay, but what drove me to that one is that there was the guy that wrote that screenplay would later be Marvel for his own fiction story. It was written by James Clavell.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, his famous works, Shogun, and all the intricate works that he did with Japanese culture and stuff like that. And it's like, and all of a sudden he writes this book about this little, help me, help me. The contrast of that has always fascinated me.
Well, it's funny now that we're talking about horror movies and stuff like that, and you're a perfect person to ask this question. Why do you think people like to be scared?
It heightens the senses. It makes your heart beat faster. You laugh because of the absurdity of you being scared for something that is actually and obviously make-believe. Mm-hmm. It's a way for you to reach out to a friend or a date. I mean, guilty, and just, react with them and have a moment. And horror does that. I mean, ever since the days of the caveman, I'm sure there were people that, sat around the campfire and told their own little hot ooga booga stories.
When you're writing books, do you ever question the scariness of certain parts? Do you say, like, that's not scary enough, or I got to tone it down a little bit?
Sometimes, and on both of those issues, sometimes. And then sometimes there's a third one where I'm going, is this being written in very bad taste? I mean, Drop Dead Gorgeous is one of my best works, but I tell people I would appreciate if you are concerned with rating systems that you don't let someone under the age of 18 read this book, because there are some strong sexual contents in that book. Every other book I have is okay, but that one is one that deserves a parental discretion is advised warning.
If people want to follow your books and they want to get a good sampling of your creations, what should they do?
Well, my books are available on Amazon. Mm-hmm. They're both under my chosen name, Allison Church. I have one book under them called Keeper of the Gates. The others are under what we call our dead name. My dead name is Donald Allen Kirch, AllenKirch. Most of my books are under that name, so consider them my DBA or my Richard Bachman phase.
Okay.
But everything that I'm writing from this moment on will be under Allison Church, because that is my chosen name, and it's the name that suits who I am in the world. So what should we expect next from Allison Church? I am writing a paranormal book in the same tradition of Rose Red and Hell House. That's called Battle Not with Monsters. And it's going to be a story of a paranormal organization, which I hope to turn into a series itself, because I have some lovely characters in it. Mm-hmm. One of them is a transgender. I don't hope that doesn't stay a motif with me, because I don't want to limit my creativity. Mm-hmm. And it's just my way of weaving myself into my new reality. I'm happy the way I am, and it's a great adventure. But the character fit the story and the story and history behind the house. When they think of Nietzsche and his quotes, they think of when man looks into the abyss looks into him. Well, Battle Not with Monsters is the line before that famous quote. And I'm always interested in not the shoe dropping, but the hand that dropped the shoe. And that's what this story is about. It's about not the haunting, but the cause of the haunting. So out of all the books that you've written, if you were to choose one that you wanted made into a movie, do you have a preference? I'm putting you on the spot here. I would say the one that the public would probably enjoy the most would be Dark Passenger, because we need to get people away from Jack and Rose. We do. And that song, too. I can't hear that song anymore. Dude, they play that song, it's still like gravel or glass on a chalkboard. Okay, so we've been talking to Allison Church, so make sure you check out her books, especially if you want a good scare rebels. She'll be the lady who can take care of that department. Allison, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you. And if you ever want me to come back, just ask. Of course.
Let's get back to the Sherpa.
Sorry about that.
Thanks so much to Allison Church for coming on down to the Sherpa Screening Room. And if you like this show, why not give me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or even Spotify if you like. And you can follow the show on any of your favorite podcast apps, any of them, they're all out there. Or if you don't like downloading podcast apps or sticking them on your computer, you can listen right on my website, Sherpalution.com, and you can see all of the episodes right from the beginning to right about now, and even the ones after that. Ooh, lots of fun there, and there's lots of interesting things happening at Sherpalution.com, so check it out if you can. I'd like to say thank you so much for coming on down and listening to the show. And we'll be back next week. And you know what? We may even do another Sherpa Screening Room. Will I? Won't I? Let's build up the suspense. Okay, Mr. Bruce, while we've got everybody in suspense, let's show everybody out the door, and we will see you guys next time. Viva la Sherpalution!
Thanks for listening to the Sherpa Screening Room. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast. I'm Mr. Bruce, and this has been a Sherpalu Studios production. Viva la Sherpalution!